Okay, so lesson 7, Confederation to Constitution. What primary doc are we looking at here? Nope, Constitution. We the people. Good job. So we'll get into that as we get into this lesson. Let's first take a look at the treaties where we left off. One treaty that we left off with in lesson 6, and some new treaties for us to uncover. The Treaty of Paris, that is the treaty that ends the American Revolution, September 3rd, 1783, brokered between the United States, France, and England. Also, were a couple other countries that are part of it. We've discussed Spain and Holland. Good job. Spain and Holland. So the United States of America is recognized. Obviously, there are conditions that America's allies received. Spain regains control of Florida. The French regain control of Louisiana Territory. There's war debt owed from the new United States to France, Spain, and Holland. England gives up all lands from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, with the exception of Florida and Canada. Jay's Treaty, a step further. That's pretty cool. Will you take a look at that? What year was that?
They started talking about signing the treaty in 1977.
Sweet.
And they signed it.
That's pretty cool. If you wouldn't mind taking a look at that, Connor just brought up Morocco being the first country to recognize American independence in 1777 during the war. That's awesome. Very cool. Nice. Trying to get an early treaty cementing an early treaty with the new United States. Jay's Treaty is another treaty drafted and framed by John Jay of New York. So we already talked about Ben Franklin of Pennsylvania, John Adams of Massachusetts, and John Jay of New York were the American diplomats in the Treaty of Paris. John Jay is going to broker a trade treaty with England, and this is not just a trade treaty, but it's also a treaty to try to cement more of a lasting peace. Two things that were not totally shored up with the Treaty of Paris that were still creating some issues were the fact that the British had not yet evacuated their forts in the Trans-Appalachian region. And another issue that is worth discussing is the fact that the British are still aiding Native American tribes in the West by providing them not only with supply, but tribute of selling them weapons. Remember, they would pay chiefs tribute and trade with chiefs out in the West. So, Jay's Treaty and the Treaty of Paris are going to both be violated by the British and will ultimately lead to the causes of the War of 1812. We'll get into that in lesson 8. Pinckney Treaty, named for Thomas Pinckney, governor of South Carolina and foreign diplomat to Spain. He's going to negotiate this treaty with the Spanish Foreign Minister Godoy, and that this particular treaty is going to try to create a little bit of a friendship with Spain. It's going to draw up a formal boundary between southern United States, because you have to keep in mind that's Georgia, and then the territory that is Alabama and Mississippi was just territory that was not, they weren't ratified states yet. And it also deals with access along the Mississippi River, but we're going to talk about some tension that occurs with the U.S. and Spain as well, because the war debts aren't being paid back, and Spain's going to cut off some American trade access along the Mississippi as well. So this period of time, Spain and France are going to control most of the access along the Mississippi. And then the Treaty of Greenville, this is not the first, but the second treaty signed with Native tribes. The first was the Treaty of Fort Stanwix that we talked about. This particular treaty, the Treaty of Fort Greenville, is a result of an American military victory led by Mad Anthony Wayne. Actually, Waynesboro, Virginia, its namesake is for Mad Anthony Wayne. This particular battle is the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where they will defeat a Native American alliance near Toledo, Ohio. And what this does is it draws up a boundary line that's going to allow for tribes to live in one area of Western Virginia, which is the Ohio country, and for American settlers to move into said territory. And we'll take a look at that as well. This is like an early movement to putting Native Americans on what? Reservations. All right, I'd like for you to take a look at these two maps. We have the Treaty of Paris map on the left here. So basically everything from Atlantic to the Great Lakes and the Mississippi, all the way down to Florida. Do keep in mind that Florida went through Alabama and Mississippi, in the southern portion of Alabama and Mississippi on the Gulf at this period of time. We'll talk about a later treaty that will be brokered, known as the Adams-Onis Treaty, to purchase Florida. And then what I've got here is the Greenville Treaty Line, and this particular map is a map of Ohio, the border of Ohio, in what would be Western Virginia and Indiana. And what you can tell about that particular treaty line is that the colonists, or not colonists, but now Americans, are to settle in this territory, as well as the Native Americans. But does that line exist any longer? Absolutely not, right? This particular treaty line will be broken very early on. The reason that I wanted to pull this particular map is to show you a couple of things. Number one, that from the earliest founding of our country, we're going to be breaking pretty much every major treaty that was negotiated with Native tribes. It's going to be a theme that we're going to be dealing with all the way through the remainder of the semester and even in the next semester. Another thing I wanted you to look at is the fact that what are these little gridded out areas? Yeah, they're counties, right? So these are going to be part of the establishment. These counties and townships are going to be surveyed out, and you're going to start having new states coming into the Union, and that's just going to push Native Americans farther and farther west onto reservations. And this theme will continue, as I said, and here in just a few lessons, we're going to be talking about one major act that is going to be passed in 1830, known as the Indian Removal Act, sending Native Americans to reservations in what is present-day Oklahoma. All right. Did you guys have any questions about those treaties? All right. So do keep in mind that the states are going to be developing constitutions in and around the time of the Declaration of Independence being drawn up. So when state delegations know that they're moving toward independence, state constitutions start to become framed, as do state declarations of rights, right? So a couple of founding things that I wanted to talk about. Massachusetts' earliest state constitutional convention. That's going to inspire other state constitutional conventions as well. In Virginia, I want everybody to pay attention to this. George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights is 1 month older than the Declaration of Independence. In fact, it was being adopted while the Declaration of Independence was being written by Jefferson. So what is the Virginia Declaration of Rights going to do? It's going to be the foundation behind the United States Bill of Rights that will later be attached to the U.S. Constitution. Another thing that I want you to think about too is most of these legislatures had already been what style of government anyway? Democratic republics. Very good. Nice job. All right? So they already had fundamental laws. They already had legislative, elective process. So that was nothing new. All right? But these state constitutions were. Yeah, for sure. All right. Another important statute, Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Did you guys pick it up on the clip there? He's so proud of this that he puts this on his tombstone, right? The tombstone they actually redid it. His original tombstone is at the University of Missouri. They won a competition to get it. But there are 3 things that were placed on his tombstone. Signer of the, author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and founder of what? 1819. Very good. Founder of the University of Virginia. His 3 proudest accomplishments: no President of the United States, no member of any Congress or Continental Congress. Those were his 3 proudest accomplishments. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, passed on January 16, 1786, becomes the foundation of the First Amendment. And other states start adopting similar religious statutes for religious freedom. All right. Something to keep in mind as well, there is a legislative branch. There is a Congress. There is no president. There is no judiciary branch. There's none of that. There are state governments that have governors, and they've got courts, and they've got legislatures. But in terms of the United States, and we're not really that united at this point, there's just a legislative body. And Jefferson, who was always sort of the devil's advocate, says, 173 delegates in a legislature may be as oppressive as just one. So that's everybody's trying to kind of keep that in mind as they're moving into the framing of this new form of government. And I want you all to take note that this government is not only framed but adopted from the time that Philadelphia is occupied by General Howe to the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. All that's taking place during the Revolutionary era. Here we have George Mason on the left and the Virginia Declaration of Rights on the right. A lot of times when you see a statue of George Mason, whether it be at the Virginia State Capitol or Washington, D.C., he'll have a quill in his hand for representative of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. All right, so the articles. The new states are no longer colonies. They chose a confederation as their first style of government. They purposely made it a loose, weak confederation where they could pretty much do their own thing. State sovereignty was more supreme than a strong federal government. There is not even the concept of a federal government yet because they don't want to become what? They don't want to become tyrannical, and they don't want to potentially go down the road of becoming, a constitutional monarchy like Parliament and George III had ruled over them previously. So during the war, they're going to create their own individual currencies. They're going to create their own tax law. They're going to have their own taxation. The articles were drafted in Yorktown, Pennsylvania. Remember, the Continental Congress was pushed out of Philadelphia in 1777, and the last state to ratify the articles was Maryland on March 1st, 1781. So they will be ratified or approved by the states before the victory at Yorktown. There are some disputes, okay? There are large state, small state disputes. So like, for example, a large state like Virginia and a large state like New York was not very thrilled about relinquishing land that they controlled west of Appalachia, right? Or they weren't too, like New York and New Hampshire, they weren't really too keen on giving up Vermont, even though Vermont applied for statehood, wanted to become a state, and will ultimately become a state. Virginia doesn't want to give up the Ohio territory. See what I mean? Another issue here too is that each state only got one vote. So a small geographic state like Osage, Rhode Island, or a small geographic state like Connecticut, both of these states had smaller populations. They had just as much strength in voting power in Congress than a large state like Virginia or New York. So this creates a great deal of tension toward the end of the war and the establishment of the new nation. Another part of this too is the war debt, right? The Congress sees them relinquishing the land as like a good thing for the nation and as a tribute for the war debt. Because if you are going to allow for people to settle in that new territory, or not new territory, but establish new states, then you're going to be able to potentially create a larger economy. And if you create a larger economy, you might be able to do what? Make more money and pay off what? Your war debt, right? Tax revenue, tax. You're not going to have like income tax like we have today. Most things that were taxed were like property and goods. So there wasn't like, yeah, we're going to talk about the listed tax. Yeah, exactly. Right? So this is like creating some early tension. New York and Virginia are like, do we really want to relinquish these lands? Especially since they had paid their war debt off pretty quickly. And it's the smaller states with the smaller populations that are having a more difficult time getting the war debt paid off. I will say, though, that the Northwest Ordinance, this land ordinance, it is the one major success of the Articles of Confederation and one that we're going to talk about here momentarily. So here we have the Articles of Confederation drafted in Yorktown, Pennsylvania, which is now just York, Pennsylvania, in central PA. Remember, they had to evacuate Philadelphia. So, as I said, the Articles were made weak on purpose, but here are the major weaknesses, and I want you guys to pay very close attention to this. So, you have no executive branch, no president, no supreme leader. You have no judiciary, no one to determine whether laws are just, or there's no high-level courts. This was, again, done on purpose because they were leaving it up to the states to have governors and the states to have the courts. All right? Pitifully weak Congress. Congress had very little power, and they only had one vote per state. So you have a lot of tension between the large states and the small state delegation. Also, you were required a 2/3 majority on any subject of importance, and you had to be fully unanimous to vote for amendments. So it was very difficult to get anything done. Congress could not regulate commerce or trade. This means trade from state to state or foreign trade. So a state like Virginia, who had a strong currency backed by what? A little bit of gold, a little bit of silver. Okay, you guys I'm really glad you all said that, because tobacco. Yeah, they have tobacco, but they also but you all are right. Virginia does have a little bit of access to some Spanish shillings, some gold, some silver. they've got a little bit of specie, they got a little bit of backing, right? A lot of colonies did not, or not colonies any longer, but states. A lot of these young states did not have that kind of backing. They didn't have that commodity. So Virginia almost seemed like a what? A country. Very good. They almost seemed like a country, more so than a state. So Virginia, standing alone, was powerful enough to dictate its commerce, not only from state to state, but also with foreign entities. This is a real chink in the armor. This might not, like, I know this is like not the most riveting lesson of your life, but this is like really important to look back at, because this is the chink in the armor where England's saying, okay, this is all going to fall apart, and we'll probably get all these colonies back, because they're going to implode from the fact that they don't have a centralized banking system, right? And do I have any Hamilton fans out there? None? Okay, a few of you? Okay, so Alexander Hamilton, he is the guy that starts to say, because remember, he's not only a military leader, he's also a political leader from New York. He's starting to think, you know what? We're going to have to look at the British model. We're going to have to look at a centralized bank. We're going to have to look at assuming the state debts. And that's what we're going to get into toward the end of this lesson and the beginning of lesson 8. We're going to talk about how those differing points of view lead to the establishment of our political party system. All right? So this is an important one. Okay, Congress can't enforce tax collection. They don't have any army to speak of, and then they have to say, like, if you want to raise an armed force to, like, collect the tax, you have to ask a state militia to rise up. Do you think a post-war, previously colonial, now state militia who has not been paid for the revolution, they're owed back money and back pension and back pay, do you think they're going to raise up and collect taxes? Probably not. Okay? So this is a major weakness. The last issue here, it's not the last, but there's other problems that we could unveil. These are the major ones. Another issue here, there's no common currency. Okay? So imagine you go on a trip with your family to Georgia and you've changed currencies 3 or 4 times, right? Depending on where you left. That would be very hard for us to imagine because we have a common currency. This was not the issue. And if you had Virginia currency might be backed by Spanish shillings or British pound or gold or silver or tobacco. You might want that currency in your hand. That creates what type of problem for other state economies? A couple of words you've probably talked about in econ. You've got, yes, you have inflation, but you also have deflation, right? And this is why we start to see these states looking like their own little countries, right? Inflation's scary. Deflation, that leads to economic collapse and depression, all right? So, do keep in mind, it's a loose confederation. It is a significant stepping stone, but people were fearful of an all too powerful state government. So, on the left, top left is the articles. On the top right, that is a $4 piece from Virginia, from this era, backed by Spanish shilling. And then this is a little overview of the articles. Do you all know who these folks are? I think you do. Know some of them, maybe not all of them. You know Jefferson, good job. We have Jefferson standing here. Good work. John Adams, good. We got John Adams. We got Hamilton here. All right, so we have Jefferson standing on the right, Hamilton seated beside him. Who is between Hamilton and John Adams? He's a really important person from Pennsylvania. He's not Ben Franklin. But Rosa, Virginia. John Jay's New York. He's a founding father that gets kind of left out of the story sometimes. His name's Robert Morris. Robert Morris. He's a framer, early framer of the really everything from. He was a part of everything from the Constitutional Convention, or the Continental Congress, to the Constitutional Convention. All right, let's look at this landmark land law. All right, it is known as the Land Ordinance of 1785, and it was, what are we going to do with all that land in the Trans-Appalachian region, right? How are we going to handle all of this? How will this new land enter as states? So what it did was it provides acreage in the old Northwest Appalachia, Trans-Appalachian, and what it was going to be used was it was going to be used to help pay the war debt, okay? And it was really one of the most successful, if not the most successful plan of the Articles of Confederation and that Congress. So we have a vast area that was surveyed. It was be settled, divided into townships, 6 square miles, 36 square sections, 1 mile each, and then they would survey out counties. One section would be provided for a public school. And then what the goal was is as they got more and more inhabitants, once they hit 60,000 inhabitants, they could have elections, frame a state constitution, and then it would go to Congress for ratification. What's up? Oh, lotteries were a huge way to raise money. Yeah. And then that was between the Northwest Ordinance, the fact we couldn't tax lotteries. That was why Hamilton was able to successfully gain the assumption, because I don't know if you're familiar with that deal, but basically the deal was brokered that the federal government would assume the state debts, and in sort of like a little bit of a consolation prize, the South would get the capital. So the reason that the capital of the United States is in D.C. is because the war debts were assumed by the federal government. You may have already done that, but we'll talk more about that later. Well, the original capital was in New York, then it moved to Philly, but there's a really great book that covers it. It's called Founding Brothers by Joseph Ellis. I've got a cool little summary for you guys to read on Ellis's book. Check out later. But yeah, lotteries were a big money maker. That's a good point. Admission was a two-stage affair, territorial at first, and then once the inhabitants were there, they could apply for statehood and then be brought in. This is a good opportunity for you to get an answer for your review here. What are your Northwest Ordinance states that were free states? This is an important moment to sort of like grasp a major problem in American history. And that is Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota will all enter as free states. Southern states from the Trans-Appalachian region will begin to enter as slave states. Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, later Florida, later Louisiana, later Arkansas, okay? Later Missouri. So what I'm getting at is that the slave state, free state balance is older than the Constitution. So when we're trying to put our finger on where did that problem begin? It began before the revolution even really ended. All right? Sure. Did you guys get those? Those free states? All right. So there's trouble at home, there's trouble abroad that the new nation is dealing with. Before Jay's Treaty was even brokered, England was trying to take care of that commerce, take advantage of that commerce problem. So they're going to try to keep their navigation laws going, and they're going to try to basically close down their trade with the United States. But then in some cases, they would flood the U.S. market with goods. Why would that create problems? If you, right. So that would like create a depreciation problem, right? Or deflation problem. So these are different tactics that England was trying to use, where they would cut off trade completely, or they would try to flood the American marketplace with goods. Jalen, do you have a question there? Okay, cool. So that's a big reason why Jay's Treaty was brokered, to try to create some fair trade with their previous enemy. Annexation of Vermont. I don't know if you all realize this, but there was an attempt by England to turn Vermont into a province, led by Ethan and Ira Allen, sort of the fathers of the Green Mountain Boys and the Vermont state movement. Vermont was getting blocked as entering as a state, and finally, out of fear that Vermont might be lost, they're going to be allowed to enter as the 14th state. The issue was, it was a land dispute between New York and New Hampshire. All right, so Vermont will enter as the 14th state in 1791. Cool little piece of trivia. It was on Jeopardy not too long back. Vermont is one of the, it's what state's last four letters are the first four letters of its capital. So what's the capital of Vermont? Montpelier. Good job. Well done. Montpelier. Another problem. England is not moving out of its chain of military forts west of Appalachia and along the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley. They're continuing to supply Native Americans with weapons, which are going to be the leading causes of the War of 1812. Spain's going to close up access to parts of the Mississippi over the war debt. Obviously, the Pinckney Treaty is going to be help remedy this problem. Spain and England are both encouraging Native American attacks in the Trans-Appalachian region, west of the Appalachian. Jay's Treaty, Pinckney Treaty, and the Treaty of Paris are all being broken in the West. France and the Dutch are demanding their war debts be paid. And to make matters really rough, remember there's not a very large U.S. Navy. There is not really a U.S. Navy, so to speak, yet. It's actually founded by President John Adams. What we do have is a small Navy, a small merchant marine fleet, not even a fleet, it's just a group of ships, and they are being attacked at sea by pirates from the Ottoman Empire known as the Barbary Pirates. We'll talk more about the Barbary Pirates. This occurs a little bit later. This is from 1803, and this is Stephen Decatur fighting Barbary pirates in Tripoli, and my Marine Corps folk out there, that's in the battle hymn, the Marine Corps hymn, from the halls of Montezuma and the shores of Tripoli. It's in reference to the Marines battling against the Barbary pirates in Tripoli in the Mediterranean. This is where we're going to wrap up for the day. Shays Rebellion. It's a really sad and tragic event in American history, but one that's very important and one that you guys need to take note of. because I feel like this is a rebellion that gets kind of forgotten about. Shays' Rebellion was led by a guy named Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays had served from Lexington and Concord all the way to Yorktown in the American Revolution. He had served with such valor that he was awarded a saber by Marquis de Lafayette for his service in the war. He returns home, and like him and many other Continental Army veterans, he was owed back pay for his service, but there was nothing to pay the man. So he couldn't get paid. He couldn't pay the mortgage on his farm, so the creditors and banks in Boston were going to seize his farm. This was a big problem in the post-revolutionary era. These guys return home, and they're trying to carve out a life for themselves, and then they can't pay the loans on their land. They can't afford it, right? So he sells everything he has, including the sword, the saber, which is like his most prized possession. And they still foreclose on the land. It's not enough. He rallies a group of veterans and folks that are dealing with the same thing in Western Massachusetts in a tavern not far outside of Springfield, Massachusetts. And the idea is they're going to rally together, they're going to raid the tavern, raid the arsenal at Springfield, and they are going to march on Boston and burn Boston to the ground with a focal point on the banks. Well, the rebellion begins in August of 1786. 4 people are killed, 20 are wounded. It is finally put down in January. He and the Shayites, as they were called, were arrested. They were all later pardoned. But what's really sad and very tragic about this event, who had to stand up and fight against them? What group of people? Very good. State militiamen. Who are the state militiamen? Yeah, they're the guys that they fought with in the revolution. So they're having to fight against themselves over a problem that they're all facing. This is a really very interesting moment in American history, and one that I hope you guys will take away with you, because this is the reason, this is the final straw for the end of the Articles and the beginning of the Constitution. As a result of this, delegates decide to meet in Annapolis, and then from the Annapolis meeting, they're going to go on to meet in Philadelphia. And that meeting in Philadelphia will be the entire summer of 1787 to ditch the Articles and pull together and frame the Constitution. It's a pretty cool wood etching of Shays' Rebellion, kind of a cool primary document that was published in the Boston Almanac in 1787. They're called the Regulators. We have Daniel Shays on the left and Joe Shattuck on the right. This is a good spot for us to stop for the day. Did you guys have any questions?